Hello all. Right, we've been looking at glaciated landscapes for some time now, and we've just got to look at the last little bit, which is right down on Enquiry question 4. How are glaciated landscapes being used and managed today? There's three key sections to this. The first one, 2.10, is where we looked at how valuable these places are. And the key with that is to both look at the cultural, economic, and environmental value, and also realize that each place is unique and has its own context and its own different levels of value to different people. The second area we've looked at are looking at the different threats these places are facing. And the spec wants you to look at the active and the relic glacial landscapes and understand that each context is different, but the relict ones face different threats to the active ones. And this is the bit we're working on at the moment. The threats and how they're being managed. So we know what the threats are, we know what's worth protecting, we now need to look at how these places are being managed and how different management approaches are needed. So we started off thinking about the different stakeholders. These are different people who have a say in how the area is managed, from people who live there to national government. They put together a legislation, a framework used to protect and conserve these landscapes. And what I want to look at today is the way climate change is making management of these landscapes more challenging. Okay, so we've got Enquiry question 4, like we've already discussed, that we're looking at use and management of these glacial landscapes. And the part we're going to deal with now is climate warming and how it's having an impact in different places. First thing to do is just to break down the title. So we've got climate change, talks about context risk. That means that each place is unique. So every unique place will have a unique set of challenges, and that includes climate change. So any successful management of these unique and fragile environments is going to become more challenging, but each place is going to have a different level of challenge. So we're going to have an approach global, national, and local. But the first thing I want to look at is this context risk. Now there's some references here, the standard 3 A-level textbooks, then a few others which are on there as well, which you can have a look at. Two questions which might come up, the type of questions you'll face on this. So explain how climate change is causing management of glacial landscapes to become increasingly challenging. So climate change happens. You're going to look at the glacial landscapes you've studied, look at the challenges it's facing currently, and look at the extent to which, well in this case it's just explaining them, or for a harder question, the extent to which this management has become more difficult. So for instance, if you're managing avalanches, it will seem fairly obvious that if climate change happens, it changes the thermal regime of the snow, it's going to make avalanches less predictable. So if you've got a ski resort, management becomes more challenging. So we just need to work on those explanations in places we've studied. Now there's lots and lots of places you could use, both relict and active. So you've got a whole list of them there, from Snowdonia to Georgia to the Yamal Peninsula. There's some page references there as well. Obviously you can pause this to have a closer look at those, but you don't need anywhere near that many. It's just you could choose to look at any one of those to make any of your points, which we're going to look at now. So why is it becoming increasingly challenging? How are we going to explain that? There's a few notes I've put on there for you, but the absolute fundamentals are here. So if I would got any question about why it's becoming increasingly challenging, I'd use the Mind Your Language sheet, the red words, but fundamentally, climate change is increasing, I should say increasing, threats. So we know that, and we can look at 2.11, what we did before. These are the different threats. So any of those threats, plus any others you wish to use, the management of them is becoming more complicated and more difficult. So we've mentioned avalanches, which is here in 2.11a. So that is going to become worse, but clearly glacial outbursts as well, because you're going to get more melting, more glacial retreat, less predictability. But equally, we can think about things like soil erosion and trampling. Slightly less obvious, but for example, if we looked at Snowdonia, the peat is drying out, and it's expected to get worse in summers because their summers are expected to get drier. So in Snowdonia, if the summers get drier, the peat dries out, it becomes less resilient or more vulnerable to soil erosion, which we can look at in a minute. So, and we've also clearly got the global warming direct links here. So meltwater, river discharge, climate change is going to change all of those. So if we go back to this, so we've got it's going to increase existing threats. It's also going to create new threats, meaning successful management is going to become more challenging. This is kind of nearly an introduction of how to get into this. However, so it does depend, if you like, that's an evaluation style way of doing this. It's going to depend on the context and the place, because each one has a different level of resilience and vulnerability. But it can't all be made worse because it's uncertain. We don't know how hot climate is going to get. We could, just to really hammer that home, in the Hodder textbook, on page 118, this is a year 13 module, but we need to be clear that we don't know how much carbon we're going to put into the atmosphere in the future. We don't know how well we're going to manage it. So the IPCC have come up with several carbon pathways, and as we don't know which pathway we're on, the level of impact on our glacial environment is also uncertain. So we've got an uncertainty there as well. If you remember those key concepts like resilience, vulnerability, uncertainty. So if we go back to this, we've got two key glacial environments, but all of them go back to that kind of introductory statement that it's going to increase existing threats, but the extent to which is going to depend on the context, not just if it's active or relict, but the context between the different active ones as well. But I would say overall, the active glacial areas have got more significant risks. So if you're doing any evaluation, more significant risk for the active. The high vulnerability is due to melting. It's going to be more obvious at the very least. So when you look at 2.11, when you're looking at the active ones, avalanches, glacial outbursts, hydrological cycles such as meltwater release, river discharges, sediment yields, high water quality, that's all going to be under threat. You already know that, but this is going to make it worse. Obviously, the greater and more climate change happens, so it's going to make management more difficult. So if we think about one example, the climate change is a threat because most glaciers are retreating, meaning it threatens landscapes such as a hydrological cycle, an increased risk of glacial outbursts. And then hopefully you've already got notes on glacial outbursts from before. If we think about relic ones, I would say instead of being really significant, but it can be, it's enhancing existing challenges, but there are some new challenges being created as well. So for example, I'm really talking about Snowdonia here. It's predicted to get hotter, drier summers, and that's going to desiccate or dry out the peat. So therefore, it's going to be less resilient to soil erosion. Now, if you look at 2.11b, you've already have notes on that, where you've got this bit here. So we've got the soil erosion stuff just sat in here. So if we think about that, if you've got more soil erosion, you're going to get higher winter rainfall. Sorry, it's going to be exacerbated by higher winter rainfall. So the soil gets drier, and then you get higher winter rainfall as well, and more frequent storms. All of that is going to increase soil erosion. Peat has to be waterlogged for it to stay as it is. It stops it rotting completely. So if you dry the peat out, you're going to make it really vulnerable, and then it starts to break down. And then in winter, climate change is likely to create heavier storms across Snowdonia and more frequent storms. So that's going to increase the runoff and water runoff over the surface, which is going to take even more of this soil away. And if you combine that, that's not climate change clearly, but if you increase tourism in the area, trampling and footpath erosion is all going to increase. If you imagine a footpath which has already been trampled, on top of which climate change is drying out the soils underneath it and causing it to break down and change, and then water in winter goes down that gully and removes even more, it's going to make management of that really difficult. Snowdonia spend a fortune maintaining footpaths already, and that's just going to become a bigger and bigger cost and more challenging to management, which is what we're trying to argue here. Now, we also earlier have established that the value of these glacial landscapes, and this little bit here, where you've got the maintaining natural systems, the carbon cycle. Now, peat is valuable because it stores lots of carbon. If it's going to desiccate or dry out, it's going to make management of that even more difficult because the peat will burn. You look up stories about how lots of moors on relic glacial landscapes, not just Snowdonia, but across the northwest as well, quite recently, have been burning because they've been drying out. Plus, the peat decomposes. That's going to mean management are going to have to really think about the water level and drainage and keep that area waterlogged, but it's going to become more and more difficult. And lastly, we've got the unique biodiversity. Now, that's another, if you look at 2.11a, it talks about this and how important it is. Now, this is just one example, but the Snowdon lily is pretty endemic. It is endemic pretty much to the Snowdon. It's a rare alpine flower, just one example. But the warming may well cause this to be lost completely from the whole of Snowdonia, and it's unique to Snowdonia. That means that management is going to become more difficult because they're going to have to, not just for the Snowdon lily, but the whole ecosystem, they're going to have to manage species moving in, or these invasive species. So again, another challenge to management. Uncertain heating. Now, with all of this, if we're thinking about the structure to our exam, you've got a little introduction talking about overall what these threats are, what makes them worse, and we've explained that, and also what might influence it in terms of the context, and being really clear. We've got the climate change itself. It's creating new threats. That's going to make everywhere more challenging, but the context matters too. You could even think about the stakeholders and so on, how well they're managing it. This all links together. We've established that the active ones are likely to have a more difficult, present more difficult challenges for management if we're doing an extent question about management. We've also established that the relic ones do face significant challenges as well, but they're not perhaps as difficult to deal with as the active ones. And then to put all that together, we've also got uncertain heating, which means we don't know how bad it's going to be. So if we're looking at this, we've already mentioned the representative carbon pathways, which are in the Dunn textbook, meaning management is uncertain. We don't know the challenge, it makes management more uncertain. Long-term investment becomes difficult. If you look at skiing in the Alps, it is threatened. It's warming faster than average anyway, in fact faster than the global average. So the consequence is people are not investing in the lower altitude resorts because of that uncertain future. So that uncertainty is causing a management issue because of lack of investment. But areas which are higher, like Val d'Isère, there's a less of a management issue. And if you look up The Guardian, and you to load this up very quickly, but this is talking about tourism and abandoned lower sites in terms of skiing, which you might be able to lift some ideas from to back up this problem of uncertainty. And then we've got positive and negative feedback. So, and this again, positive and negative feedback are those key concepts in the A-level geography course. So because it adds uncertainty to the extent of heating, to climate change, the permafrost melts, and we've talked about the issues that's going to have for people who operate in oil installations. That's another challenge to management because it ruins a building if you think about thermokarst. Meaning the greenhouse gases, more greenhouse gases are released as the permafrost melts. We've already done this before. More heating, more melting, and consequently more challenging to manage. So a positive feedback system in terms of the whole of climate change and global climate change, as the permafrost melts, it's going to create a positive feedback system, but we don't know how bad it's going to be. Similar locally with the Himalayan glaciers, when they start to melt, will the surfaces in that area become less reflective or their albedo drops? There's 1 billion people, as you already know, are reliant on that for a water supply. It goes back to the value here where you've got maintaining natural systems and this stuff here, the river discharges and the water quality. So it's maintaining that valuable glacial landscape. So before we look at adaptation, mitigation, what we've done there is set out why management is increasingly challenging. So going back to the inquiry question, so it's a context, every environment's different. The key way of dealing with that is separating it into active and relict because they both have different challenges in terms of climate change. The next little bit we need to look at is just the need for a coordinated approach. Okay, we're nearly there. The last little bit of this is just dealing with this last area. So this need for a coordinated approach at a global, national, local scale. And we've also got to think about the need for mitigation and adaptation. So we go right down to the bottom of this doc. We've got to deal with those two words. So the first one, adaptation, is dealing with the impact of global heating. Global warming as a word sounds too benign, whereas global heating increases the threat level, which is why that term has started to be used by climate scientists, just so you can see the change in the wording I'm using. So the direct impact of global heating, you've got to deal with it. So you accept it's happening, such things like sea level rise, peat's going to dry out, you're going to get drier summers in Snowdonia. You've got to work out what to do about it. That's adaptation. So like it says there, it's necessarily because global heating is and will continue to happen. That's high certainty. And I'm using the words from the IPCC there, high certainty. But the extent is uncertain. And that will depend on those relative carbon pathways, those representative carbon pathways, which we discussed earlier. Therefore, the level of adaptation is unknown, which is a challenge in itself, but we do need to manage the threats as they happen and also have long-term planning in place. Now, in terms of adaptation, there's lots of ideas in the notes here. We've also mentioned some of them on Snowdonia, and also page 110 of Frost, or 108, also looks at how we can adapt to some of these issues in glacial landscapes. So for example, in Snowdonia, we can manage the peat, we can manage the drainage, we can manage invasive species. Ski resorts, they can move higher, so they're going to the areas where you're going to get more reliable snow, but that will have ecological consequences because you're going to start to exploit pristine glacial areas. So that is the kind of thing you can use for the adaptation part, thinking about how a few of the glacial landscapes you've already studied can adapt to this threat. And it's pretty well documented in the textbooks and you've done it up to a point already with some of the stuff you've already looked at in terms of how these glacial areas are going to adapt to some of the issues. Mitigation that's about dealing with the cause. So that's actually reducing how much climate change actually happens, how much the temperatures increase. Essentially, it's about reducing the emission of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon. Now, you can look at this on a global scale, a national scale, and a local scale. All three have to come into play. So on here, I've put some notes on the international mitigation response. And the main way they're doing this is the UN Conference of Parties meets and they decide how the world is going to go forward. Most of the meetings since the 1990s are on this table with a summary of what they've found, what was achieved. But you can bring yourself up to date with looking at the more recent ones as well. But the key here is realizing that as a country, we cannot prevent climate change or slow it down. As a world, we can't stop it anymore, but we can slow it down if we all work together. So the idea is all the developed and developing nations work together to reduce their emissions. And that involves things like sharing technologies, agreeing about how much carbon we're going to emit. If you think about it, if one country becomes very clean and spends lots of money reducing its carbon output, it would make its factories and its industry less competitive if someone else is just using the cheapest energy such as coal. So you need to get agreements between countries to make this work, and that's what this is about. So globally, we need to all reduce our carbon emissions, but clearly then that comes down to national governments to work out how to do that. And then every locality, like regional and councils in this country, people who are managing the national parks, right down to the individual, also need to reduce our greenhouse gases. That's the only way it can ever work. So when we're looking at glacial areas specifically, they're doing it within an international international framework. So you can, in terms of glacial areas, these 4 areas are a good place to start. So you may already have notes on this in terms of a management anyway, but restoring peat in Snowdonia would mean it becomes a big carbon sink. If you restore it, it actually takes carbon in. If you maintain it, it keeps the carbon stored. The worst thing we can do is let that peat dry out because of climate change. It starts to rot and releases its greenhouse gases. Zermatt in Switzerland is doing lots. There's all sorts of bits and pieces in the Frost textbook around page 110, which talk about what they're doing in these places. So these different ski resorts, these different areas, and what they're doing to reduce their carbon, and also adapt, and also in some cases adapt as well. So you've got adaptation down here and some mitigation going on in here. And there's loads and loads on the internet on this about looking at renewable energy in the Himalayas. One of the things they're doing is looking at microgeneration, spending a lot of money on small little micro hydroelectric power stations to create green energy for the local people, which makes a lot of sense up there. So that's it. So if you so the key with this, as I say, going right back to the top, just to pull it all together. So climate change is going to affect each context differently. So successful management is going to get worse and more difficult. And then all those management techniques, they're going to have to be coordinated. So globally, things like maintaining the peat in Snowdonia, well, that's part of a global initiative with the IPCC and the Conference of Parties as well, in terms of when we look at our carbon footprint, this is all taken into account when we make agreements with other countries, just as is afforestation, which is another way of reducing net carbon emissions. And then we've got the national approach responds to the global approach. And then we got right down to the local, and so nationally would involve the national parks and Snowdonia, right down to the local farmers and local management, which is going on as well. And then we finished off by thinking that mitigation. So this part of the topic's really looking at mitigation in terms of what's going on in the glacial environments. So, for example, how the ski resorts are using more solar power, becoming more efficient and causing less greenhouse gas emissions. And adaptation, where these same resorts starting on the same places start to adapt to climate change. But that would include things like managing the species in Snowdonia, which you've already looked at. Okay, thank you. We'll leave it there.